Different kinds of embodied language. Do people of different cultures comprehend action-related language in a different way? The fact that action words and sentences recruit sensory-motor information is quite an established finding. Many consolidated research lines address this issue. Here, the authors focus on three of them, that is to say, the studies on the relationship between action verbs and involvement of effectors, the studies on the action-sentence compatibility ACE effect, and the studies on the spatial interference effect. Action verbs and effectors. When we process action verbs and sentences entailing action verbs, we implicitly activate the effector to which the words refer. Seminal EEG and fMRI studies have demonstrated that different areas of the brain are activated when reading verbs referring to different effectors, such as kick, lick, pick, and those parts of the brain are activated in a somatotopic way. ACE effect. When participants process sentences referring to a movement away from or toward their body, for example, open and close the drawer, responses are facilitated in case of congruency between the action implied by a sentence and a real movement, away or toward the body, performed to respond. The typical ACE task is a sentence sensibility evaluation 1, in which participants are required to decide whether the sentence makes sense or not. Spatial interference effect. When visual stimuli instead of only words are presented, a reversed effect is obtained. That is to say, no facilitation but an interference is reported. The spatial interference effect is an effect of attention on language, showing that processing words with spatial associations, for example, bird or hat, can reduce the capability to identify an unrelated visual target, for example, X, at the implied location, that is to say, at the top of a display. Overall results from the three lines of research we have outlined reveal that the meaning of the language is intimately tied to the actions it refers to. However, the results obtained are not always coherent. There is certainly a crosstalk between language and action, but some studies report that language processing interferes with action execution, while others find a facilitation. Action verbs in literal and figurative sense. While numerous studies have demonstrated a tight relationship between language and motor system, only a small subset of studies have investigated whether action sentences still recruit sensory motor information when used in an abstract sense. For example, if we hear or read the sentence, "He does not grasp the concept," do we still activate the grasping movement? Most results show that also figurative sentences involve areas engaged in processing concrete sentences, and thus are grounded in the sensory motor system. Mixed combinations led to longer response times, especially when the concrete word preceded the abstract one. This shift in cost can be ascribed to the hypothesis that concrete and abstract words are processed in parallel systems, one more linguistic and the other more sensory motor. Action-language crosstalk in different cultures. The aim of this study is to investigate the relationship between language and motor responses using both concrete and abstract sentences in two different languages, Italian and Persian. Studies on the relationship between sentences with action verbs have been conducted so far only with weird participants, that is to say, participants of Western cultures in North American and European countries. Here, the authors use sentences that referred either literally or metaphorically to motor actions with no directional information. These sentences were accompanied by a video displaying a movement that could be congruent or incongruent with the one described in the sentence. Participants were asked to reproduce the movement observed in the video. Then they had to perform the task evaluating whether the sentence made sense or not. The reason why the authors decided to show participants a video and ask them to perform the observed movement is that they intended to boost motor activation in order to verify its relationship with language processing. To investigate whether the relationship between language and movement was the same across the two different cultures, they submitted the same task to Italian and Iranian participants. Notice that these two cultures are likely not extreme in their Western-Eastern characteristics. For example, Italian culture is less individualistic than US culture. Iranian culture likely differs from East Asian cultures on a variety of dimensions. Evidence has shown that belonging to a Western or an Eastern culture influences a variety of cognitive processes, starting from perception to decisional processes. For example, Asian people tend to perceive the environment in a more holistic way. Western cultures are generally more analytic sense of agency differs as well. Western people tend to perceive events as the outcome of a choice more often than Eastern people. Similarly to other Asian cultures, Iran can be considered as a collectivist culture, as testified by the presence of extended families, by the important role played by the in-group, by the strong sense of national belonging, and by some linguistic habits such as the frequent use of the pronoun we instead of I. Because of the strong differences between typical weird cultures and Iranian culture, the authors intended to test whether the compatibility effect found in real cultures extended also to an Iranian sample. In the present research, the authors established some hypotheses. First, they predicted that there would be a difference between congruent and incongruent trials, likely leading to a facilitation of congruent over incongruent trials since the timer started after the sentence was presented. Second, they predicted that action sentences would elicit faster responses compared to abstract ones, in line with the previously discussed results on figurative sentences and on the well-established concreteness effect, showing that concrete words and sentences are processed faster and recalled better than concrete ones. Third, and more crucially, they advanced the hypothesis that the congruency action video with a sentence would be perceived as stronger in the case of concrete sentences, leading to a greater difference in response times between concrete congruent and incongruent trials than between abstract congruent and incongruent trials. As to the cultural and linguistic difference, the authors advanced two hypotheses, hypotheses 4 and 5. In fourth, they intended to investigate whether the congruency effect they expected to replicate in the Italian sample would be extended or not to a different culture. And finally, they intended to investigate whether using a different language has a different effect with responses to concrete and abstract sentences. They expected the difference between the two languages to be more marked with abstract and with concrete sentences, in line with the idea that linguistic experience is more influential on abstract than on concrete sentences processing. As regards the methods, in this study, 35 Iranian and 38 Italian participants took part. All Iranian participants were native Persian speakers and had left Iran for less than 8 years and were now living in Rome. They were recruited in dorms of Iranian students or in Iranian meeting points in Rome. Out of the 35 Iranian participants, only 5 spoke fluent Italian. In addition, all 38 Italians were Italian native speakers. All participants had normal or corrected to normal vision. As regards stimuli and procedure, for the Persian sample, stimuli consisted of 14 sensible sentences in Persian. Each sentence was composed of a third-person subject, a transitive verb, and a concept noun. In 7 sentences, the verbs were used with a concrete meaning. In the other 7, the same verb were used in a metaphorical sense. Additionally, they combined the verbs with the nouns to create 7 meaningless sentences. The word order of Persian sentences is subject, object, verb, which is the unmarked word order in Persian. Moreover, as both the sentences were selected by asking for 14 Persian people to rate them through a 7-point Likert scale according to a list of parameters, useful to determine the degree of abstractness of the sentence, concreteness versus abstractness, imaginability, emotionality, age of acquisition, modality of acquisition, body-object interaction, social metacognition, quantity of motion, and perceptual strength. For the Italian sample, stimuli consisted of 18 sensible Italian sentences, composed of a third-person subject, a transitive verb, and a concept noun. 9 of them referred to concrete contexts. The other 9 were metaphorical sentences, and the remaining 9 were meaningless sentences. The sentences were selected by asking to 17 Italian people to rate them through the same 7-point Likert scale above mentioned for the Iranian group. The abstract concrete sentences were compared for different parameters, abstractness and concreteness.
Well, as regards the results, the analysis was only restricted to the sensible sentences. The non-sensible ones were not included because they were not informative for the experiential question. In the first model, the authors included effects for the variables of congruency, category, and group. In the second, in the third, and in the fourth model, they excluded these variables. But in the fifth, in the sixth, and the seventh model, the investigation was with all the factors together. In contrast with the Italian group, in the Persian group, abstract sentences were processed faster than concrete ones in the congruent conditions. In the Italian sample, there were no differences between the congruent and the incongruent conditions. But in the Persian sample, stimuli were processed significantly faster in the incongruent than in the congruent condition. Well, in the discussion of this paper, the results show that action sentences are grounded in action, even if the extent of their grounding differs as a function of the abstractness level. More crucially, the marked differences between Iranians and Italians are food for thought and induce kind of reflection. All the participants were late bilinguals, and only 5 of 35 spoke fluent Italian, and they frequented mostly Iranians. The research on bilinguals show that they have a flexible linguistic organization. When they were tested in their own language, participants tend to revert to their structures used in the taxonomic conceptual relations when they speak in English, and more thematic one when they speak in Chinese. In addition to this, we may say that age has a marked effect of the degree of cognitive shift towards the L2. And based on these considerations, we may say that the authors explains that exposure to the Italian language and culture may not have markedly influenced on these results. As regards the Italian, evaluating the matching between the action and the sentences was easier for the concrete than for the abstract sentences, and this advantage of concrete over abstract sentences was present both for the congruent and incongruent conditions. If we talk about Iranians, we can say that the pattern of results of Iranians did not match that of the Italians. Surprisingly, it was quite different. First of all, a reverse congruency effect was significant. The congruent condition was lower than the incongruent one. And furthermore, the advantage of concrete congruent trials found that in the Italian sample was not extended to the Persian culture. So, as regards hypothesis 4, this was not confirmed. In the congruent condition, abstract sentences were processed faster than concrete ones. This profoundly differs from what happens in the Italian sample, because in the Persian sample, the condition with slowest response times is that of concrete congruent trials. That is to say that the faster condition in the Italian sample. Apparently, when reading sentences, Iranians stimulate the mentioned action, and this stimulation interferes with the action they observe and perform, generating like an inhibition in the congruent condition. And this inhibition is particularly marked with concrete sentences, consistently with the fact that they are grounded to a greater extent in the sensory motor system. In the comparison of both samples, for Italians, it seems that language and action are quite integrated, while for Iranians, they are processed separately. The inhibition found that the Iranian sample might reflect an overload due to the fact that the motor system is activated by the video movement and that this exerts a primary effect on the motor activation evoked by the sentences. This distinction between concrete and abstract sentences seemed to be more marked in Italian than Iranian participants, because in the Italian sample, the authors found that a facilitation with concrete sentences, both in the congruent and incongruent conditions, and an opposite pattern with an abstract sentences. But in contrast, in the Persian sample, the three-way interaction shows that in the congruent condition, abstract sentences were processed faster than concrete ones. The higher continuity between concrete and abstract sentences can be owing to the fact that Persian language is more like a literary and metaphoric language, for example, poems, literature, and so on. And also that abstract sentences in Persian seem to be more embodied than in Italian, that is to say, that concrete and abstract sentences seem to rely on common schemes to a larger extent than in Italian. As regards the role and importance of metaphor and figurative speech in the Persian language, metaphors, we can say, are the heart of Persian language. A reason of the differences in the factor category can be owing to differences of perceptual strength across the two languages. In the two groups, there was a difference of this kind, because abstract and concrete sentences differed only for touch in the Persians, while they differed also for vision in the Italian set. However, perceptual strength differently influences the two languages. It loaded more on concrete items in the Persian sample, more on abstract items in the Italian sample. This different role of perceptual strength might thus contribute to explain the differences in the concreteness effect, which was present in the Italian sample but not in the Persian one. So two possible explanations may be possible at this time. There is like a linguistic difference between Italian and Persian. In the Persian sentences, the verb is placed at the end of the sentence, in contrast with the Italian, which is located immediately after the subject. Hence, when the visual and motor stimulus match with the verbal one, there is like a facilitation. When they do not, or they cannot be easily integrated, then there is an interference. So, what is the difference between Italian and Iranians? The difference relies on the writing direction is opposite, left-right in Italian and right-to-left in Persian. The orthography, for example, is more transparent in Italian than Persian, and the Italian gesture system is more structured and more integrated with language compared to Persian. The Italian system is more structured and includes much more gestures. In order to conclude with this paper, and based on the two experiments, all the results confirm the tight relationship between language and action, stronger for concrete sentences than for abstract ones. The results also reveal a marked cultural and linguistic difference. This is while observing a video and imitating an action inhibits concrete congruent sentences in the Iranian sample. It leads to trend towards facilitation of the same ones in the Italian sample.
As regards pedagogical implications, it can be stated that through the use of embodied language, students might learn the language in an implicit way and through their own experience. For instance, when teaching and when learning countable and uncountable nouns, for example, in relation with food, students might learn the difference between countable and uncountable nouns and might learn the words, for example, water and bananas, and how to refer to those nouns by touching and experiencing with the real objects. For example, if students touch and identify that bananas can be separated one by one, but we cannot separate water, they may realize about the difference of countable and uncountable nouns and might be able to use numbers or quantifiers with bananas, but different quantifiers and no numbers with water. Thanks to the use of embodied language, students can experience and can learn different areas connected with a foreign language.